August 7, 1942, 6:13 a.m. USS McCauley, off Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. First Lieutenant Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, watched the jungle-covered island emerge from the pre-dawn darkness through his binoculars. In 23 minutes, 11,000 Marines would hit Red Beach in the first American amphibious assault of World War II. Intelligence reported 2,200 Japanese laborers and a small garrison defending an unfinished airfield. What Vandegrift didn't know, what American planners couldn't have imagined, was that this obscure tropical island would become the crucible where American offensive capability was forged through 6 months of savage combat, where 60,000 Americans and 36,000 Japanese would fight in jungles, on beaches at sea, and in the skies for control of a single coral airstrip barely 3,800 feet long. The intelligence was catastrophically incomplete. Japanese reinforcements were already loading onto destroyers 600 miles north. Admiral Yamamoto was preparing to commit the entire combined fleet. And the Marines who would land that morning were about to discover that taking the airfield was the easy part. Holding it would require fighting off 7 major Japanese counteroffensives, surviving naval bombardments that would make the island shake like an earthquake, and enduring supply shortages so severe that men would fight on half rations while battling malaria, dysentery, and an enemy who believed death in combat was the highest honor. This is the story of how America learned to fight Japan, how industrial capacity clashed with warrior spirit, how a secondary operation became the turning point of the Pacific War, and how an island nobody had heard of in August 1942 would become synonymous with American determination and Japanese desperation. The mathematics of attrition were already in motion, but neither side understood yet that Guadalcanal would become a meat grinder that would devour Japanese offensive capability and transform American forces from novices into the most effective amphibious force in history. The strategic accident. Guadalcanal wasn't supposed to matter. In May 1942, as American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications about an airfield under construction in the Solomon Islands, planners barely noticed. The island was a pestilential backwater, 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, covered in jungle, swamps, and Kenai grass that grew 7 feet high. But that airfield changed everything. From Guadalcanal, Japanese bombers could strike American supply lines to Australia, could intercept shipping through the Coral Sea, could provide fighter cover for further advances into the South Pacific. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, studied the intelligence reports and made an immediate decision: seize that airfield before it becomes operational. The operation, codenamed Watchtower, was thrown together in 8 weeks. Staff officers called it Operation Shoestring because of inadequate resources, incomplete intelligence, and untested troops. The 1st Marine Division had been training in New Zealand but lacked proper equipment for jungle warfare. Many had never fired their weapons in combat. None had experience with amphibious assault under fire. Intelligence was almost comically inadequate. Aerial reconnaissance provided grainy photographs. Australian coast watchers, brave men hiding in the jungle with radios, reported Japanese activity but couldn't provide detailed information. Maps were incomplete, often wrong about terrain features. Nobody knew about the rivers, swamps, or disease environment. The Japanese garrison was underestimated at 2,200 men, mostly Korean laborers of the 11th and 13th construction units with a small security detachment. The reality: 2,571 personnel, plus combat engineers who had built defensive positions around the airfield perimeter. Most critically, American planners didn't understand Japanese strategic doctrine. When Americans took the airfield, Japanese military culture would demand its immediate recapture regardless of cost. Guadalcanal would stop being a construction project and become a sacred objective that must be retaken to restore honor. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, commanding South Pacific Forces, was pessimistic from start. His July 8th message to Admiral Nimitz was brutally honest. The operation is not sufficiently advanced to give assurance of success. "We are undertaking this with inadequate forces, insufficient time for training, and incomplete intelligence." Nimitz's response was equally blunt: "Do it anyway." On August 7, 1942, at exactly 6:36 a.m., the first landing craft hit Red Beach near Lunga Point. Marines expecting fierce resistance found nothing. The beach was empty. No Japanese defenders. No opposition. Just coconut palms, jungle, and oppressive heat. By 4 p.m., 11,000 Marines were ashore. By August 8th at 4 p.m., they had captured the airfield without serious combat. Japanese construction workers and their security detachment had fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and rice stockpiles that would prove crucial in coming months. The Marines renamed the airfield Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, killed at Midway. That afternoon, Brigadier General Roy Geiger radioed Admiral Fletcher, "Airfield secured. Can receive aircraft." But Fletcher wasn't listening. He was already leaving. At 6:14 p.m. on August 8th, Admiral Fletcher made the decision that would doom thousands. Concerned about fuel levels and fearing Japanese carrier attacks, he withdrew his 3 aircraft carriers, Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, from the Guadalcanal area. The carriers provided air cover for the invasion fleet and the Marines ashore. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, was furious. His transports were still unloading supplies. Marines ashore had received only 4 days of supplies instead of the planned 10 days. Without carrier air cover, his ships were defenseless. Turner called a conference aboard his flagship USS Macaulay at 8 p.m. He informed his commanders that all ships would withdraw the following morning, August 9th, whether unloading was complete or not. The Marines would have to make do with what they had. What none of them knew was that Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa was approaching with 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, a naval force specifically assembled to destroy the American invasion fleet. At 1:38 a.m. on August 9th, Japanese lookouts spotted the American screening force. 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers divided into 2 groups protecting the approaches to Guadalcanal. The Battle of Savo Island lasted 32 minutes and became the worst defeat in U.S. Navy history. Mikawa's force achieved complete tactical surprise. His cruisers were equipped with superior optics, better training in night combat, and the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the most advanced torpedo in the world with a range of 11 miles at 49 knots. USS Canberra was hit first at 1:43 a.m. 8-inch shells and torpedoes struck her within minutes. She was dead in the water, burning. USS Chicago took a torpedo hit that blew off part of her bow, but somehow survived. The Northern Screening Group fared worse. USS Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy were caught in a crossfire between Japanese cruisers. All 3 were sunk within an hour. Captain Frederick Reefcole of Vincennes didn't even know he was under attack until shells were already hitting his ship. He managed to get off a radio message at 1:50 a.m., under attack by cruiser-type vessels. Require immediate assistance. No assistance came. By 2:16 a.m., 4 American heavy cruisers were sinking or sunk. 1,077 American sailors were dead. Another 709 were wounded. The Japanese force sustained minimal damage. 3 cruisers lightly hit, 58 men killed. Admiral Mikawa, having achieved the most one-sided naval victory of the Pacific War, made a controversial decision. Rather than proceeding to attack the vulnerable American transports, he withdrew. His reasoning was sound. American carriers might be nearby, and daylight would leave his force exposed to air attack. But that decision saved the Guadalcanal operation. If Mikawa had continued to the transport anchorage and destroyed the supply ships, the Marines ashore would have been stranded without supplies, ammunition, or hope of reinforcement. As it was, Admiral Turner withdrew his transports at 6:30 a.m. on August 9th, leaving the 1st Marine Division with 4 days of rations instead of 30 half, the planned ammunition, almost no barbed wire for defensive positions, no heavy construction, equipment, limited medical supplies, no way to evacuate casualties. Major General Van de Grift assembled his officers at 9 a.m. that morning. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are alone. We have an airfield. We have whatever supplies we've managed to unload. And we have each other. Our job is to hold this position until the Navy can return. That might be weeks. That might be months. So we dig in, we conserve ammunition, and we prepare for the Japanese to come in force." The Japanese were already coming. The Japanese called it the Rat Operation. Americans would name it the Tokyo Express or simply the Rat Run. High-speed destroyer runs down the slot, New Georgia Sound, to deliver troops and supplies to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. The first run came on August 15th. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commanding Destroyer Squadron 2, loaded 900 troops of the Ichiki detachment on his 6 destroyers and made a nighttime dash to Guadalcanal. The destroyers could reach 35 knots, too fast for American submarines to intercept, and they arrived and departed under darkness to avoid air attack. Colonel Kaineo Ichiki's force landed at Taivu Point, 22 miles east of Henderson Field, at 1 a.m. on August 19th. Ichiki was a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines. His troops were elite naval landing forces with absolute confidence in their superiority over American forces. Japanese intelligence had grossly underestimated American strength, reporting only 2,000 Marines on Guadalcanal. Ichiki's orders were to recapture the airfield with his 900 men, with promises of reinforcement if needed. What Ichiki didn't know was that 10,900 Marines were dug in around Henderson Field, armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery, and they'd had 12 days to prepare defensive positions. On August 19th, a Marine patrol encountered Japanese scouts near Alligator Creek, misidentified as the Tenor River on American maps, a name that stuck. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Getch led a 25-man patrol that night to investigate. At 10:30 p.m., the patrol was ambushed. Only 3 Marines escaped. Getch and 21 others were killed in what became known as the Getch Patrol disaster. Colonel Ichiki interpreted this as evidence of American weakness. On August 20th at 10 p.m., he launched a frontal assault across Alligator Creek, directly into the positions of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. The Japanese attacked with absolute confidence in their martial superiority. Ichiki's plan was simple: a bonsai charge across the sandbar at the creek mouth, break through the Marine line, and sweep inland to capture the airfield. The Marines were dug in with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun positions covered every approach. Artillery was pre-registered on likely crossing points. When Japanese troops emerged from the jungle at 1:30 a.m. on August 21st, they charged into a killing zone. Private Robert Leckie, 1st Marines, later wrote, "They came in waves, screaming, firing from the hip. We couldn't miss. They just kept coming, climbing over their own dead. It was slaughter." The .30 caliber water-cooled Browning machine guns fired continuously for hours. Barrels had to be changed as they overheated. Ammunition was replenished from dwindling supplies. Artillery fired over open sights directly into charging Japanese formations. By 3 a.m., the Japanese assault had stalled. Bodies were piled 3 deep in some places. Marines estimated 200 enemy dead in front of their positions. But Ichiki wasn't finished. At dawn, he regrouped his surviving forces, perhaps 400 men, and prepared for another assault. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell, commanding 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, saw the opportunity. Rather than simply repelling another attack, he called for an envelopment. At 7 a.m., Marine units crossed the creek upstream and downstream of the Japanese position, forming a pocket. What followed was systematic annihilation. Marines advanced with rifle fire and grenades, compressing the Japanese into a smaller and smaller area. Light tanks from Company A, 1st Tank Battalion, forded the creek at 8:30 a.m. and drove along the beach, crushing Japanese positions under their treads. By 5 p.m. on August 21st, The Battle of Tenaru was over. Of Ichiki's 900 men, 777 were dead. 15 were captured, most of whom committed suicide shortly after. The rest escaped into the jungle. American casualties: 34 dead, 75 wounded. Colonel Ichiki burned his unit colors and committed ritual suicide that evening. His death was honorable by Japanese standards. His tactics had been suicidal. But Japanese command didn't interpret Tenaru as evidence that Guadalcanal required major forces. Instead, they concluded that Ichiki had been reckless and that a properly planned assault with adequate forces, perhaps 5,000 men, would easily recapture the airfield. They were wrong, but that mistake would define the next 4 months of combat. While Marines fought ground battles, Henderson Field became the most valuable piece of real estate in the Pacific. The first aircraft arrived on August 20th, 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 dauntless dive bombers of Marine Air Group 23, flying off the escort carrier USS Long Island. Major John L. Smith, commanding VMF 223, landed at 4:12 p.m. and immediately asked where he could refuel. The answer revealed the desperate state of supplies. Aviation fuel was being hand-pumped from 55-gallon drums because proper refueling equipment hadn't been unloaded before the transports withdrew. But Henderson Field was operational, and that changed everything. Japanese ships could no longer operate near Guadalcanal during daylight. The Tokyo Express runs continued at night, but daylight belonged to American aircraft. The Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's code name Cactus, operated under conditions that would have been impossible for more conventional units. Pilots flew multiple missions per day. Ground crews worked 16-hour shifts repairing battle damage with improvised parts. Aviation fuel was rationed so severely that pilots learned to conserve every gallon. Captain Marion Carl, VMF 223, described conditions. "We flew whatever plane was available. Sometimes you'd fly 3 different aircraft in one day as others got shot up or broke down. We had no spare parts, so we cannibalized wrecks. Tires were patched with rubber from Japanese trucks. We made do because we had no choice." The Cactus Air Force's primary mission was defending Henderson Field from daily Japanese bombing raids. At 11:45 a.m. every day, so regular you could set your watch, Japanese bombers from Rabaul would appear, escorted by Zero fighters. The routine became known as Tojo time. Air raid sirens would wail. Marines would sprint for foxholes. The Cactus Air Force would scramble to intercept. Fighter pilots climbed to altitude while bombers cratered the runway and strafed everything in sight. The Japanese bombing campaign was methodical and relentless. Between August 20th and November 15th, Henderson Field was attacked 32 times by medium bombers and 22 times by dive bombers. The strip was cratered repeatedly, forcing ground crews to work through the night, filling holes so operations could resume at dawn. August 24th brought the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, a carrier battle northeast of Guadalcanal, where aircraft from USS Enterprise and Saratoga engaged Japanese carriers supporting a troop convoy. The Japanese lost the light carrier Ryujo and had to turn back their reinforcement convoy. American aircraft from Henderson Field sank the transport Kinryu Maru, drowning hundreds of Japanese reinforcements. But the most dramatic action occurred on September 13th when Marine Corps dive bombers discovered a major Japanese reinforcement convoy, the Kawaguchi Brigade, being landed at Taiva Point. SBD dauntless dive bombers sank 2 transports and damaged a third, killing hundreds of Japanese troops before they could reach shore. Major Richard Mangrum, leading the dive bomber squadron, reported, "The transports were packed with troops. We could see them crowding the decks. After a bomb's hit, the water was full of swimming men. Some were on fire. It was necessary, but it was horrible." By September 1942, Henderson Field had become the cork in the bottle. As long as American aircraft controlled daylight, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal couldn't be adequately supplied or reinforced. But those forces kept coming, delivered by the Tokyo Express in numbers that would soon threaten to overwhelm the Marine defenders. By early September, Japanese command had committed to a major offensive. Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi landed 6,200 troops, the Kawaguchi Brigade, at multiple points around the Marine perimeter with orders to recapture Henderson Field. This time, Japanese planners believed overwhelming force would succeed where Ichiki's reckless charge had failed. The plan was sophisticated, simultaneous attacks from three directions on the night of September 13th to 14th. The main assault would strike from the south, hitting the ridge south of Henderson Field where the jungle met the defensive perimeter. Secondary attacks from the east and west would pin down Marine forces, preventing reinforcement of the threatened sector. What Japanese planners didn't anticipate was that Marine intelligence had broken their codes. Major General Vandegrift knew an attack was coming and approximately where it would strike. He reinforced the southern perimeter with his best troops, the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, elite units commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. The terrain favored defense. A coral ridge ran roughly north-south, dominated by a grassy knoll that offered commanding views. Edson positioned his 840 raiders and parachutists along this ridge with orders to hold at all costs. September 12th at 9:30 p.m., Japanese artillery opened fire on the ridge, the prelude to attack. At 10 p.m., the first wave emerged from the jungle. What followed was 2 nights of the most savage close-quarters combat of the Pacific War. Private Robert Leckie described the first night. They came screaming out of the darkness. "Marine, you die." Hundreds of them. We fired until our rifle barrels were too hot to touch. They'd fall, more would come. It never stopped. Just waves of Japanese soldiers climbing over their own dead to reach our lines. The Japanese attacked in human wave assaults, believing that martial spirit and numerical superiority would break the Marine line. Officers led charges with samurai swords. Troops fixed bayonets and charged straight into machine gun fire. The courage was undeniable. The tactics were from another century. Marine machine guns fired continuously, burning through ammunition at alarming rates. Mortar crews fired illumination rounds to silhouette attacking Japanese forces. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions, sometimes landing shells within 100 yards of Marine positions. By midnight, Japanese forces had pushed the Marine line back 600 yards. At 2:30 a.m. on September 13th, the situation was critical. Edson's command post was under direct assault. Japanese troops had infiltrated to within grenade-throwing distance of Henderson Field itself. Edson walked the line under fire, rallying his men. His words became legendary. "The only thing the Japs have that you don't is guts. You can take him." At 4 a.m., with ammunition running critically low and men fighting hand-to-hand in places, Edson called for naval gunfire support. The destroyer USS Monson moved close inshore and fired 5-inch shells over open sights into the jungle 200 yards south of the ridge. The barrage temporarily halted the Japanese assault. Dawn on September 13th revealed carnage. Japanese dead were piled in front of Marine positions. The raiders and parachutists had held, but barely. Casualties were severe, 135 Marines killed or wounded. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Japanese casualties were staggering, perhaps 600 dead, but Kawaguchi still had thousands of fresh troops. He would attack again that night. September 13th at 6:30 p.m., Japanese artillery renewed bombardment of the ridge. At 9 p.m., the second night's assault began, even more intense than the first. Private Joseph Rushing, 1st Raiders, later recounted, "The second night was worse because we were already exhausted. We'd had no sleep. We were down to maybe 100 rounds per man, but they kept coming. There was no choice but to hold." The fighting devolved into desperate close-quarters brutality. Grenades, bayonets, rifle butts, entrenching tools, anything that could kill. Japanese troops broke through in several places, forcing Marines to counterattack to restore the line. At 11 p.m., the Marine line bent but didn't break. At 2 a.m. on September 14th, Kawaguchi committed his final reserves, a mass assault aimed at the center of Edson's position. Artillery fire from the 11th Marines, firing from positions near Henderson Field, tore into the attacking force. The 105mm howitzers fired at maximum rate, tubes so hot that paint burned off. By 4 a.m., the Japanese assault had failed. Kawaguchi ordered withdrawal. His brigade had suffered catastrophic losses, 850 dead, hundreds wounded, and accomplished nothing. The Marines had held. Casualties, 263 dead or wounded out of 840 engaged, nearly 30% casualties. But Henderson Field remained in American hands. The ridge where Edson's men had fought would be renamed Edson's Ridge, and Lieutenant Colonel Edson would receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership. More importantly, the Battle of Edson's Ridge proved that Japanese infantry tactics, human wave assaults, and bonsai charges couldn't overcome prepared defensive positions supported by artillery and machine guns. The Japanese would continue using these tactics for the rest of the war, and they would continue to fail at horrific cost. October brought a new horror to Guadalcanal. Naval bombardment so intense that survivors would call it worse than anything they'd experienced. On the night of October 13th to 14th, the Japanese battleships Congo and Haruna approached Guadalcanal at 1:33 a.m. For the next hour and 23 minutes, they systematically shelled Henderson Field with 14-inch armor-piercing shells, 918 rounds of naval artillery that turned the airfield into a cratered moonscape. Marines huddled in foxholes as the island shook with continuous explosions. Private O'Marion described it. The ground jumped with every hit. You couldn't hear anything but explosions. Men went mad, literally insane, from the concussion. Some just started screaming and couldn't stop. We thought it would never end. The bombardment destroyed 48 aircraft, half the Cactus Air Force. Aviation fuel dumps were hit, sending massive fireballs into the night sky. Ammunition dumps exploded. The runway was cratered so badly that operations seemed impossible. But at dawn on October 14th, combat engineers and Seabees went to work filling craters. By 2 p.m., a narrow strip was operational. By 4 p.m., aircraft were taking off to intercept Japanese reinforcement convoys. The next night, October 14th to 15th, Japanese heavy cruisers Chokai and Kinagasa shelled Henderson Field again, 752 rounds. Another devastating bombardment. More aircraft destroyed. More craters. More Marines driven to the edge of sanity by the relentless explosions. And the night after that, October 15th to 16th, more shelling. Major General Vandegrift later wrote, "I thought we'd reached the limit of what men could endure." But they kept working. Every morning, the engineers would fill the craters. Every evening, we'd brace for more shelling. The men developed a kind of fatalism. If a shell has your name on it, there's nothing you can do. So you just keep working. The bombardments were preludes to the largest Japanese ground offensive yet. The 2nd Sendai Division, 20,000 veteran troops, were being landed piecemeal by the Tokyo Express throughout October. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakitake, commanding Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, planned a coordinated assault that would finally retake Henderson Field. October brought other changes. Major General Alexander Vandegrift received reinforcements. The 7th Marine Regiment, the 164th Infantry Regiment of the Army's Americall Division. By October 23rd, American forces on Guadalcanal numbered 23,000 men. But reinforcements came with problems. Army and Marine Corps units had different equipment, different radio frequencies, different tactical doctrines. Integrating them under combat conditions was challenging. The Japanese offensive began on October 23rd with diversionary attacks from the east. The main assault would come from the south, again, with the bulk of the Sendai Division attacking across the same bloody ground where Edson's raiders had fought in September. Santa Cruz and Henderson Field, October 23rd to 26th. The Japanese offensive had 3 components: ground assault to recapture Henderson Field, carrier aircraft to destroy American air power, and surface naval forces to shell the airfield and support ground troops. The Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th was the carrier battle component. Japanese carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, Zuho, and Junyo engaged American carriers Hornet and Enterprise northeast of Guadalcanal. The battle was tactically a Japanese victory. Hornet was sunk, Enterprise damaged. But strategically, Japanese losses in experienced aircrew were unsustainable. They lost 99 aircraft and pilots who couldn't be replaced. While carriers dueled at sea, the Sendai Division attacked Henderson Field from the south on the night of October 24th to 25th. The main assault struck positions held by the 7th Marines and 164th Infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had positioned his men in defensive positions south of the airfield. At 7 p.m. on October 24th, Japanese artillery opened fire. At 9:30 p.m., the first attack wave emerged from the jungle. Private First Class Joseph Champagne described the assault. They came in formations shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed. Officers leading with swords raised. They didn't even try to take cover. Just marched straight at us. We opened fire at 50 yards and cut them down. They'd fall. The next wave would come. It was mechanical slaughter. The Japanese attacked repeatedly throughout the night. Each assault was met with interlocking machine gun fire and pre-registered artillery. The killing was industrial in scale. By midnight, Japanese dead were stacked in front of Marine positions. At 2 a.m. on October 25th, a major assault penetrated the line held by Company B, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. Puller personally led a counterattack, armed with a pistol, rallying his men to restore the line. Private First Class Mitchell Page, a machine gunner with Company H, 7th Marines, manned his position alone after his entire squad was killed or wounded. For hours, he single-handedly held a critical section of the line, firing his .30 caliber Browning until the barrel glowed red. When Japanese troops close to within feet of his position, he picked up the 40-pound machine gun, still hot, and charged forward, firing from the hip. His action stopped a breakthrough and earned him the Medal of Honor. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. Casualties were catastrophic, between 2,000 and 3,000 Japanese dead. American casualties, 86 killed, 192 wounded. But fighting continued. On October 26th, Japanese troops attacked again, this time from the east against positions held by the 164th Infantry Regiment, Army soldiers in their first combat. The soldiers of the 164th, who had been mocked by Marines as inexperienced, performed superbly. They held their positions under repeated assaults, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking Japanese forces. By October 27th, the Japanese offensive was over. Lieutenant General Hayakitake withdrew his battered forces into the jungle. The Sendai Division, which had landed 20,000 strong, was combat ineffective with perhaps 12,000 effectives remaining. More critically, Japanese offensive capability was broken. They had committed their best troops, achieved tactical surprise, and still failed. The pattern was now clear. American defensive firepower, particularly artillery and machine guns, made frontal assaults suicidal. But Japanese tactical doctrine had no answer beyond repeating the same attacks at greater cost. November brought the climactic naval battles that would decide Guadalcanal's fate. Japanese command had committed to a final, overwhelming offensive. They would land the 38th Division, 15,000 fresh troops, destroy Henderson Field with naval bombardment, and recapture the island regardless of cost. The operation required transporting troops in slow merchant vessels, which meant achieving temporary naval superiority to protect the convoy. Admiral Yamamoto committed 2 battleships for cruisers and numerous destroyers to the operation. American intelligence, reading Japanese codes, knew the offensive was coming. Admiral William Halsey, who had replaced the pessimistic Admiral Gormley as South Pacific commander, was determined to stop it. His orders to his naval commanders were characteristically blunt. Attack, repeat, attack. The First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal erupted on the night of November 12th to 13th. A Japanese bombardment force, 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 14 destroyers, approached Guadalcanal to shell Henderson Field. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan intercepted with 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. What followed was the most confused and brutal surface action of the Pacific War. The forces collided at point-blank range in darkness. Ships were so close that large-caliber guns couldn't depress enough to hit targets. Destroyers rammed cruisers. Friend and foe were indistinguishable in the chaos. The battle lasted 37 minutes, 1:48 a.m. to 2:25 a.m. When it ended, both sides had been savaged. American losses: light cruiser USS Atlanta, destroyers USS Barton, USS Laffey, USS Cushing, USS Monson, 4 destroyers and 1 cruiser sunk. Heavy cruiser USS San Francisco, light cruiser USS Portland, light cruiser USS Helena, and 3 destroyers damaged. Rear Admiral Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, both killed. 1,439 American sailors dead. Japanese losses: battleship High crippled and scuttled the next day. 2 destroyers sunk. Critically, the bombardment mission was aborted. Henderson Field was not shelled. But the Japanese reinforcement convoy was still coming. On November 14th, Marine and Navy aircraft from Henderson Field discovered the convoy, 11 transports loaded with 15,000 troops, escorted by destroyers. What followed was a massacre. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked the convoy throughout the day. 7 transports were sunk. 4 more were damaged, but continued toward Guadalcanal. Japanese commanders, desperate to land troops, ordered the 4 surviving transports to beach themselves at Tassafaronga Point. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleships USS Washington and South Dakota, accompanied by 4 destroyers, intercepted a Japanese bombardment force, 1 battleship for cruisers and destroyers, attempting to cover the troop landing. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was a decisive American victory. USS Washington's radar-directed fire struck battleship Kirishima repeatedly at 8,400 yards, point-blank range for 16-inch guns. Kirishima was reduced to a burning wreck and scuttled. 1 Japanese destroyer was sunk. American losses: 3 destroyers damaged, South Dakota damaged but operational. At dawn on November 15th, the 4 Japanese transports that had beached themselves at Tassafaronga became targets for American aircraft and artillery. Throughout the day, they were systematically destroyed. Japanese troops who made it ashore, perhaps 2,000 out of 15,000, had no supplies, no heavy weapons, and no way to be reinforced or evacuated. The November naval battles broke Japanese strategic capability to reinforce Guadalcanal. They had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 11 transports. More critically, thousands of experienced sailors were dead, losses that Japanese shipyards and training programs couldn't replace. Admiral Yamamoto, reviewing the casualty reports, understood what had happened. The Americans had learned to fight at night. Their radar gave them an advantage Japanese optics couldn't overcome. And American industrial capacity was producing ships faster than Japanese forces could sink them. On December 12, 1942, Japanese command made the decision that confirmed Guadalcanal's strategic importance. They would evacuate. The island that had to be retaken to restore honor would be abandoned to preserve what remained of Japanese forces. The Americans had won, but the cost had been staggering.